Hello, welcome to the Persuasive Faith channel. My name is Rick Harvey, and I am the teacher of an adult class at Trinity Baptist Church in Norman, Oklahoma, in which we explore questions and objections which people might have as to the credibility of the Christian faith. We call it Persuasive Faith. This is a one-year-long class that we provide for the members of our church, and we are now in our 6th year of providing the class. Of course, normally we meet in a classroom setting, but due to the current coronavirus restrictions, we are now, at least temporarily, we hope, meeting online, and we are using the Zoom format to facilitate that. Of course, the Zoom program makes it quite easy to make a video of the class, which we are doing, and then making that video available online to members of the class who may have missed a class or who wish to repeat some material, or to anyone else who might enjoy the class. I have edited the video down to include only the instructional portion of our time. Incidentally, we also have a website at persuasivefaith.org where you can access an audio podcast of all of our lessons throughout the year, as well as other things like class handouts and other resources. I hope you'll find this video informative and worthwhile, and if you do, don't hesitate to hit the like button so that other people on YouTube can know that there's material here that they might also find beneficial. So God bless, and here's today's video. Okay, so we have, in the last couple lessons, we've talked about just how the first century people would have understood the whole idea of resurrection, what people thought about resurrection, that sort of thing. Then last week we talked about the historical evidence for the resurrection. So speaking in more of a general sense, what is the historical evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus? But that still leaves us the whole question about how the Gospels tell the story of Easter Sunday. And as many people, anybody who's read all 4 Gospels with any kind of, discernment at all, they see that those stories really are quite different in many ways. And so that's one of the issues we want to deal with today. And then we want to talk about just the meaning of the resurrection. So we'll probably get into more theology today than we have all year long. But so that's what we want to talk about. So clearly, as I said, there are differences in the way the 4 Gospels report the events of Easter, of what we think of as the first Easter Sunday morning, right? So much so that Robert Funk, who is he's the co-founder of the very skeptical Jesus seminar, okay? He says regarding the resurrection accounts, he says they are hopelessly at variance. He sees so much difference in the accounts that there's just no way to reconcile them. And so his conclusion is we just ought to throw out the whole story of the resurrection because the Easter story is just so hopelessly at variance. N.T. Wright, who is just a well-known New Testament scholar and Jesus history scholar, but he is conservative, and he has a different perspective. He refers to what he calls the obvious, apparent surface inconsistencies. So to him, they're not irreconcilable. In some cases, he says they're just apparent. In other cases, they may seem to be inconsistencies, but he refers to them as being surface or peripheral to the main story. So clearly there are some differences, and we could think about some of them, some of the main ones that people point out. So for example, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it tells us that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus. But Luke tells us that it was Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, okay? And people say, so was it one person that buried Jesus, or was it 2 people that buried Jesus? And then there's the question of who was at the tomb when the women came to the tomb. And here they're all over the map. John says that there was one person at the tomb, or one individual at the tomb. Matthew says there were 2. or possibly even more. Or excuse me, we're talking here about the women. Did one woman come to the tomb? Did two women come to the tomb? Were there more women who went to the tomb? How many women went to the tomb? Okay. And then the third point is the one I was, the one I kind of getting ahead of myself on is the angels or the individuals that were at the tomb. Was there one, as Matthew says, or were there two, as John says, that were angels? Or was it one young man, as Mark says, or was it two young men, as Luke says? So they're just kind of all over the map there. A fourth one is Luke appears to report that Peter ran to the tomb, and he's the only one he reports running to the tomb. On the other hand, John says that somebody else went with Peter to the tomb to verify the report of the women. And then there's interesting, if you read Luke, you read through the story of Luke, all of the events seem to occur on Easter Sunday. So the whole thing from the resurrection to the ascension all seem to appear on one day, okay, when you read Luke. On the other hand, if you read Matthew and John, it's stretched out over many days, all right? And then there's Mark, which, because we apparently don't really have the ending of Mark, the Mark of what we are confident is actually Mark's gospel ends at verse 8. There are 8 more verses that are typically in your Bible, but most scholars agree those were added later by somebody else, that the actual gospel of Mark ends with verse 8. And it's totally up in the air as to what happens after the women leave the tomb. So there's all these differences and in some places even apparent contradictions that people encounter. And we want to talk about those. We want to ask ourselves, how should we think about differences in general? How should we approach them? And we want to think specifically about some of these and some others. But before we do, we need to make sure that we don't myopically focus on just the differences. Because what's really impressive about the gospel accounts is how many things they agree on, right? And so, for example, all the Gospels agree that whatever happened on the first day of the week, and that was the third day since the crucifixion, and that those important events happened early in the morning. They all agree on that. They all agree that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. So whatever women they have at the tomb, they all agree that Mary Magdalene was there. They all agree that there were others there also at the tomb. They all agree that the stone was rolled from the entrance. They all agree that there was someone there at the tomb, either angels or men, one or two or whatever. They all agree that there was someone else there, and that they all agree that whoever it was wearing this kind of white or very dazzling white clothing. And they all agree that whoever it was there at the tomb, whether it's angels or men or one or two, that they informed the women when they came to the tomb that Jesus was risen, that his body wasn't there. They all agree that the tomb was empty, Jesus' body wasn't there. All the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree that the women left the tomb and went to tell the disciples. Mark, as I said, is ambiguous on that. Matthew and John agree that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. Luke and John agree that Peter and another disciple, John, went to see for themselves. Now, immediately when I read that, you know, wait a minute, now, Rick, you're contradicting yourself, because I just said that Luke said only one went, okay? And now I'm saying that Luke says that two went. Well, we'll come back to that, and we'll see why I say that in a minute. And then can Matthew, Luke, and John agree that Jesus appeared to multiple people on multiple occasions over a period of days, all right? So these are all things that the Gospels agree on. So one of the things we need to keep in mind, I'll come back to this in a few minutes, one of the things we need to keep in mind is when we encounter these differences about Easter Sunday morning and what happened at the empty tomb, as we think about that, we need to keep in mind what is the crucial detail and what are peripheral details. for example, in one sense, all of this about the empty tomb, although there's a great deal of emphasis in it in the Gospels, as I've mentioned before, it never comes up again. The empty tomb never comes up again in the New Testament. In fact, by the time we get to Pentecost 6 weeks later, Peter doesn't even mention the empty tomb. When he's preaching his sermon on Pentecost, he doesn't even mention the empty tomb. The issue that's constantly repeated, the evidence that's constantly repeated, are the eyewitness appearances of Jesus. That's the thing that the church really rests its case on. So in one sense, the whole debate about what exactly happened on Easter Sunday morning and who was at the tomb and who wasn't at the tomb is in one sense a peripheral question. The real question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Okay? And we see here, of course, that the Gospels are in a great deal of agreement. So we can think then about the differences with that in mind, all right? So there are several things to keep in mind when we think about the differences in the gospel accounts. So in the first place, we need to ask ourselves, is the variation between one gospel and another, or between the gospels, are they contradictions? Are the thing that's troubling us, is it a contradiction? Is it some kind of a logical contradiction where it could only be one way or the other? It can't be both. Is it a contradiction, or is it simply a difference in the way they tell the story? So Mike Licona is one of the references that I've given you over the last couple of weeks. Mike Licona likes to talk about the guy versus gal way of telling the story. He talks about how when he yeah, when he tells a story, it's different than his wife tells it. I was thinking about, and you'll see this when we have our fellowship here in a couple of weeks. When my wife and I are sitting around at dinner or something with a bunch of guests and we start telling stories, if my wife starts telling the story, I'm biting my tongue because I'm thinking, that's not how I would tell the story, and I'm sure she does the same when I tell the story. I'm more inclined to interrupt her than she is to interrupt me, but we just tell stories differently. And my wife oftentimes, she likes to give a lot of background information that I'd rather skip, And so I want to get to the main point of the story. You guys are probably wondering that because I obviously give a lot of background information. My wife's worse than I am at that. But at any rate, it's just different ways of telling the same story, right? J. Warner Wallace, you may be familiar with him, of course. He's a very well-known cold case detective. He works on cold case murders, okay, and he's also a great Christian apologist. And he points out that if you take, when they have multiple witnesses to a particular crime or a murder or whatever, what they want to do is they want to keep them separate. They want to get them in different rooms or whatever and have them tell their story differently before they have a chance to interact. And he points out that if you get two witnesses to an event and they tell exactly the same story, sometimes using the same words, that raises a question as to the credibility of their testimony. Because it's just normal when you have multiple people witnessing something and then telling the story that they will tell it differently. Okay? And I think that's exactly what we encounter with the Gospels. The other thing we need to keep in mind is that we are not reading 21st century academic biography. Okay? We are reading Greco-Roman bio. And we've talked about this before, Greco-Roman bio has certain characteristics to it. So they wrote biographies somewhat differently than we write them today. So if you think of a scholarly biography today, there's a certain precision and exactness and that sort of thing that we expect today from a scholarly work today. But we're not dealing with 21st century scholarly works. We're dealing with first century Greco-Roman biography or Greco-Roman bio. And there are certain characteristics that they exhibit. One is chronology isn't always that critical in Greco-Roman bio. And in fact, this isn't just true back then. my wife and I and Teresa were watching the movie Seabiscuit. Any of you watched Seabiscuit? Okay, it's a little rough. The language is kind of rough in it in places, but if I have a favorite movie, it's got to be one of my favorite movies. It's the story of a racehorse and the people around this racehorse during the time of the Depression. And there's one point early in the movie where the Depression sets in, October 29th, 1929, okay? And it shows the date on the screen, and then the Depression starts. And then a little later in the movie, it puts the words on the screen, 6 years later. So then you advance the story 6 years, okay? And then a little bit later in the movie, it gives a date on the screen, some date in 1933. Whoops, wait a minute. We went forward 6 years, and now we're coming back 2 years, okay? So clearly what's happening here is the screenwriter telling the story. The chronology isn't the most important thing. The flow of the story is what's important. And so to one degree, he ignores the chronology in order to tell his story, okay? So we even have that today. Well, it was certainly true also with Greco-Roman bio. I'm getting lost here with my people on Facebook, so let me catch up here. Okay, there. Sorry about that, guys. I'm running two videos here at the same time, and sometimes I get missed. Okay. So then the second thing is sometimes you have time compression. Okay. So a story is told where things are condensed, and you're really not told how much time is transpiring. So oftentimes this is done for the sake of the narrative, for the sake of the story. You don't want to bog people down with details about time. All right. Another characteristic is that the importance of the narrative flow, and that's where this whole idea of chronology and time compression comes in. There's a narrative flow that the writer of Greco-Roman biography is wanting to communicate, and so temporal precision is not so much an issue, all right, as well as some other things that aren't necessarily as much an issue as the flow. And then there's the difference just between portrait and photography. We kind of expect our modern day biographies to be photographs. They're very precise and very exact. But Greco-Roman biography is more of a portrait, okay? It's still representing reality, but not with exactly the same kind of precision that we would see in the 21st century. So these are things we need to think about when we read the Gospels and not demand that they do things in a particular way. Another point to consider is what is the historical significance of the variation? So this goes back to something I mentioned a few minutes ago. So is this variation between the gospel accounts, is it something that really is profoundly significant as far as what actually historically happened, or is it more peripheral? So even if maybe in our minds there are some issues that aren't completely resolved, and I'll be honest with you, as I read these gospel accounts, there are one or two points where I go, I don't know how to understand this, I don't know how to explain it, okay? But the question is it peripheral, or is it really central to the main issue, okay? So this goes back to that question of, did Jesus rise from the dead? That's the main issue, okay? And what is the evidence we have for that? And if I can't resolve in exactly my mind exactly what women were in what place at what time, that's really not too troubling to me, because the evidence for the resurrection is overwhelming, and the eyewitness accounts and all that sort of thing. So we just need to keep that in mind. So for example, Lacona likes to tell the story of the sinking of the Titanic, okay? So when the Titanic sank, you have all these survivors out in these lifeboats out in the ocean, okay? It's the middle of the night. The only thing you can see are a few other lifeboats out there and people, and this humongous ship, okay? That's all you can see. And an iceberg, presumably, right? Well, it turns out that when these survivors were interviewed, some of the survivors said that the ship split in half and then sank. And other survivors say, no, the ship sank intact. How do you get that wrong? I mean, there's only one thing out there to look at. Okay, it's just, it's this humongous ship. How do some people come away with the impression that it split in half and sank, and some people think it sank intact? Well, given that discrepancy, we have since concluded that the Titanic didn't sink. Right? Okay. This is the kind of thing we're dealing with. So there are issues that are peripheral. How the Titanic sank is not important. Nobody doubts the Titanic sank. Right? The evidence for the sinking of the Titanic is just overwhelming. Turns out that for many decades they didn't know how it sank. They just knew it did. Okay. Turns out they found it split in half on the bottom of the ocean, 20 years ago or so, or whenever. It's when they finally figured that out. Okay. So the next thing to keep in mind is just the complexity of the situation. So here we are. We're in a major ancient city. It's the city of Jerusalem. It's the middle of a festival. You have literally 100 or 200,000 extra people there, pilgrims there, in addition to the residents of the city. You have a major festival going on. You have multiple disciples of Jesus there. You have a crucifixion. You have all the fear and all the gossip and all. Just think about all the different stories we're getting today about the coronavirus. We're just getting information from all kinds. The situation is just chaotic. Okay? So it was chaotic in Jerusalem at the time, and there's probably no better example of that than the women. So we'll take some time and think about the women. But we know that there were many women who followed Jesus to Jerusalem from Galilee. All right. And it appears that these women were kind of in groups. For one thing, we know that some of the women were actually residents of Jerusalem. Some of them came from Galilee, but some of them were residents of Jerusalem. So there's a very good evidence that Salome was a resident of Jerusalem. Okay, so what this means is that you have some women who are coming from Galilee who are needing a place to stay. And we know that some of the disciples were staying in Bethany that week and then walking back to Jerusalem each day, back and forth from Jerusalem to Bethany. We can assume that some of these women were maybe staying in Bethany or staying in other places in Jerusalem, and some of them may have been staying in the homes of some of the women who lived in Jerusalem. Okay, so we have a very complex situation of women kind of scattered all over the city on Saturday night before the day of the resurrection. So what's very likely to have happened is that you have various women coming from various places in Jerusalem to the tomb early in the morning. All right. Now, I always kind of assume maybe they agreed ahead of time that they were going to meet at the tomb or whatever. But I don't assume for a moment that they all left from the same place and all walked together to get there. What does that mean? That means that in telling the stories about them going to the tomb and them returning from the tomb, you're going to get a variety of experiences, right? So let's think about the women some more. So let's go back to the crucifixion. So who was at the crucifixion? And this gives us some clue of what women were around on the day of the resurrection, okay? So we do know that at the crucifixion, Matthew says there were many women from Galilee. Okay. In addition, there's, like I said, some women from Jerusalem. Okay. So there are many women from Galilee, and then he lists some of those women. Among them, he lists Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph. We don't know who James and Joseph were. Okay. But apparently Matthew expected that his readers would know who James and Joseph were. Okay. And then there's the mother of the sons of Zebedee, and that would be Salome, okay, who is the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. All right. We know this from other accounts in the Gospels. Secondly, we have in Mark simply reports some women are at the crucifixion, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome. Salome is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So So Mark is reporting the same thing, basically, that Matthew is reporting. Or it could be the other way around, because many people believe that Matthew was using Mark as a point of reference. Then Luke says at the crucifixion, it's all of his acquaintances, that is, Jesus' acquaintances were there. So this means that most of the disciples were apparently there at the crucifixion. And the women who accompanied him from Galilee. And then John reports Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary's sister, Salome, the wife of Zebedee, Mary, the wife of Clopas, who we believe was some kind of official in Jerusalem. So this Mary would have been a resident of Jerusalem. And Mary Magdalene. So right here we have three Marys. That makes the story even more complex, because you have multiple people with the same names, okay? So this just illustrates the complexity of the situation that we're encountering. So when we come then to the question of the women at the tomb, Matthew, he reports Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. What other Mary? Yeah, which one of these several Marys is he talking about? We don't know, all right? But he says, concerning them, he says, they came to look at the beginning of dawn, so very early in the morning, and Jesus met them and greeted them, he tells us in verse 9. Okay, so these women, or a woman, Mary Magdalene at least has some encounter with Jesus. Mark reports Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, and he says that they brought spices. They came very early in the morning, and he says they came together with each other and they were speaking with each other. Okay? But again, this doesn't mean that all the women who came to the tomb came together. We just know that the three he's talking about apparently came together. That seems to be the idea that Mark is communicating. Then we have Luke, okay? And he just, he refers to the women who had come from Galilee at the end of chapter 23. And then he specifically identifies, later in the chapter, he identifies Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women also. So he identifies three by name and then says there's plural other women. So that means there's at least 5 women involved. Okay. So we know there's a minimum of 5 women involved. So you begin to get the picture that this is really kind of a complex situation with multiple women living in multiple places or staying in multiple places in Jerusalem and having different experiences as they went to the tomb and came back from the tomb. He says they came bringing spices in the early dawn. And then in John just simply tells us about Mary Magdalene. It's the only one he reports, all right? And she came to the tomb actually twice. So she comes early while it was still dark. So apparently she leaves for the tomb while it's still dark. And then she gets there and she encounters the empty tomb, etc. And then she runs to tell the disciples, specifically Peter and somebody else. And then Peter, according to John, Peter and another disciple, possibly John himself, actually run to the tomb to verify her report. So then she follows Peter and this other disciple back to the tomb. So now Mary Magdalene has 2 experiences at the empty tomb. So presumably she has an experience where she encounters this angel or angels or man or whatever. And then she also has an experience where she encounters the risen Christ. Which one of those 2 times did she encounter that? Okay. From John, it seems like it was the second time. But the point I'm trying to make here is that as we think about this account and we encounter these variations, we have multiple eyewitnesses telling us the story of multiple people's multiple experiences. It's not surprising that we would have some kind of variation in their stories, and we need to think very carefully before we conclude that there's any kind of a contradiction in what they're telling us. So let's think about some of them. So for example, who buried Jesus? So was it Nicodemus? Was it Joseph of Arimathea? Or was it Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus? John, who is writing much later than the others. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are writing earlier. John's probably writing a decade or two later. John includes Nicodemus in the report. Now, first of all, let me tell you, when I think about them taking Jesus from the cross and burying him, I know Joseph of Arimathea did not do that alone. How do you take a body of a full-grown man off a cross, a dead body, transport it some distance to a tomb, along with all the embalming materials that you need to take with you to wrap him, because we know he was wrapped, we know he was embalmed. Okay, how do you carry all of that stuff to a tomb by yourself? Obviously, we know Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea didn't do that. He had servants or he had somebody else who was helping him. We're just told in the three Gospels about Joseph, but we can't assume that it was only Joseph. John tells us that at least Nicodemus was also involved. The question is, why does John tell us about Nicodemus and the others don't? Well, it turns out that John had told us about Nicodemus earlier. Remember John chapter 3, Jesus' discussion with Nicodemus, whom we learn in John chapter 3 was a secret disciple because he was afraid of the Jews. We also learned that he was on the Sanhedrin. All right. So it's possible that John, writing much later, includes the story of Nicodemus in the resurrection account because he had told us about Nicodemus earlier, and he wanted to follow up the story. It just makes perfect sense. The others may have either not known about Nicodemus, or they may have intentionally excluded him for any number of reasons. For example, it may have been at the time that they wrote that Nicodemus was still on the Sanhedrin, and they didn't want to in some way compromise him if he was still in some ways sensitive or secretive about his following the Lord. Or it just may simply mean that to them, Nicodemus wasn't an important player in the story. He is to John, because to John, he's been a character in the story earlier, so he's more important. So there are various reasons why they may not have included him. But the simple fact that they didn't include him doesn't mean he wasn't there. All right. The second point is how many women were at the tomb. Okay, so we've already covered this some, but so there's several different women who go to the tomb. There are at least 5, we know, as I said, likely from different locations in Jerusalem and the vicinities, and they've been coming from Jerusalem proper. They may have been coming from Jerusalem proper. They may have been coming from Bethany as well. We don't know where all they were coming from. Okay. And we just assume that they had, if they came from different places and made their way in different ways to the tomb, that they would have had different experiences. But those experiences are not inherently contradictory just because they're different. And particularly, as I mentioned, you have Mary Magdalene. Obviously she comes twice to the tomb, so she actually has 2 different experiences of coming to the tomb, right? So each author here is referring only to the women who are important to the story that he is telling. That may be because they're the only women he's aware of. It may be because they are the women to whom he has access, so he could get their personal testimony, and he doesn't include others that he couldn't confer with. There are many times when I'm writing something, that there's something I'd like to say, but I just don't have enough documentation that I feel comfortable. So I'm pretty sure it's true, but I just don't include it because I can't back it up. Okay, so it may have been in some cases that they didn't have access to some of these women, so they may not have included all of them. Or it may have been that the writer knew that the ones for whom he was writing had access to certain of the women, and they didn't have access to others. That certain of the women were still alive or lived in this vicinity, so that if they wrote to their if they wrote to their readers and they said, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so went to the tomb, their readers could go and actually talk to those women. So there are a number of reasons why they would include, different authors would include the names of different women who went to the tomb. And then there's Mark's account, okay? And as I say it seems truncated. It seems like Mark just kind of ends abruptly at verse 8. So it's really impossible for us to know what the women actually did after verse 8. So in verse 8, we actually have the women returning from the tomb. And we never get them to the point where they encounter the disciples. You get that in those later verses that virtually all scholars agree were added later, okay? So Mark really doesn't tell us what happens after the women are on their way back from the tomb. And one of the interesting things is that Mark says in verse 8, he said nothing to anyone. So if you just read that and you go, oh wait a minute, the other accounts, they tell us the women came back and they saw the disciples and they told the disciples. Why does Mark say they said nothing to anyone? Well, remember, Mark's story stops before they get back to the disciples. So apparently this remark, they said nothing to anyone, is referring to them as they are going back from the tomb. So they're not it says they don't tell anyone because they're afraid. So as they're going back through Jerusalem, they're not saying anything to anybody. But we know they did tell somebody eventually. How do we know? Because we know their experience. They tell us what happened at the tomb. So obviously we know what happened at the tomb. They must have told somebody. Okay, so it seems that what Mark is saying here is simply that as they're going back from the tomb in their fear, they're not saying anything to anybody till they get to the disciples. But as I say, Mark is ambiguous. Number 3, so was it angels, according to Matthew, or men at the tomb, according to Mark and Luke? So which was it? Okay. Actually, as I recall, I believe John says, I don't have it on there, but I believe John says it was angels. Okay. Or an angel. Well, this is really not a problem at all. This is one just is so simple to me. Is Scripture oftentimes refers to angels as men, right? So, for example, in Hebrews chapter 12, the writer of Hebrews actually tells us that people have entertained angels without knowing about it. A classic example is Abraham before the fall of Sodom, before the destruction of Sodom. And in the story, it says 3 men came to him. Okay, but it turns out one of them is the pre-incarnate Christ. Yeah, but in the beginning of the story, it says 3 men came to him. So this is really no problem at all. I just assume they're angels and that they're just reported as men because that's oftentimes how Scripture talks about angels. Okay. Number 4, was it 1? According to Matthew and Mark, or was it 2, according to Luke and John, and were they men or angels? Okay, we've already talked about that, but was it 1 or 2? Okay. Well, if you have a witness reports an angel, that doesn't preclude more than 1 angel. If you have a witness that says only 1 angel, then that precludes more angels, right? If he says that they saw an angel or they talked to an angel or whatever, that doesn't mean that there wasn't more than 1 there. Okay? And a classic example of this principle at work is in our next point, which is the situation with Peter. So Peter goes to the tomb. In Luke 24, in verse 12, Luke reports that Peter went to the tomb. He doesn't say only Peter went to the tomb, okay? He says Peter went to the tomb. But John says it was Peter and the beloved disciple, presumably also John, okay? So which was it? Well, actually, it turns out that Luke knew that more than Peter went to the tomb. How do we know Luke knew that? Well, because 12 verses later, in verse 24, he's in the story of the Emmaus Road. Okay, so the disciples on the Emmaus Road, and they encounter Jesus. They don't know who he is, and they're talking to Jesus, and Jesus is saying, "What happened? And what are you talking about?" And the disciples on the Emmaus Road say to Jesus that some who were with us, quote, went to the tomb in response to the women's report. So in other words, 12 verses after Luke says Peter went, he reports that the disciples on the Emmaus Road said more than just Peter went, that there were others who went with Peter. So in other words, earlier in the chapter, Luke is just reporting on one, but clearly he knows there were more than one, because 12 verses later, he reports the disciples talking about more than one going to the tomb. So this illustrates the importance, this explains this point, but also the previous point that I was making about one or two angels. Is just because somebody says one, or they saw one, doesn't preclude the possibility of more. And we see that quite clearly here in this case with Luke. And then again, does everything happen on Easter Day, as Luke seems to say, or does it happen over a number of days, as the other Gospels, Matthew and John, indicate? Particularly John goes into more detail. Okay. And this again appears to be a case of time compression. So Luke doesn't explicitly say it all happened on Easter. It's just the way he tells the story, and you get to this, and there's no talk about any additional days. Okay. But we know that Luke knew that it happened on more than one day. That took place over a period of days. How do we know that? Because very early in his sequel, the book of Acts, he reports that Jesus appeared to many disciples over 40 days. So Luke knew it was more than one day. He's just using time compression there in Luke chapter 24. Okay. So what I'm trying to illustrate for you is how, if you just stop and think about these variations or these apparent differences, or what some people think of contradictions, if you just think about them carefully and look at the data, look at the evidence, most of them just actually pretty easily fall into place, and you can explain them if you remember those 4 principles that I gave you about how do we think about these differences. Okay. So in the time we have left, I just want to talk about, so what does it all mean? Because really, as I think about the resurrection of Jesus, it really is our chief apologetic. This is the one big gun. Of all the things we have talked about this year, the scientific evidence and all that stuff is important, of course, or we wouldn't have spent time on it. But I think the one big gun we have is the resurrection, the evidence for the resurrection, the reality of the resurrection. So what does it mean? Well, actually, it turns out that the resurrection of Jesus, powerfully communicates to us several things. First of all, Jesus told us prior to his death that the resurrection was the authority for what he said and what he did. So the Jews that said to him, "What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things, for the things you're doing and for the things you're teaching?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. So the first thing about the resurrection, not necessarily in priority, but the first thing about the resurrection is it validates the message of Jesus. It tells us that he had authority for the things that he did and the things that he taught. Secondly, the resurrection is the proof that Jesus is both Lord and Christ. So he brings this out right off the bat in his sermon at Pentecost. "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible to be held in his power. Brethren, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. So Peter's argument is, to the Jews, he is the Lord and he is the Christ. And we've talked about the difference between those two. And this is proven to them, Peter says, by the resurrection. Now, Paul brings out the same thing in Romans chapter 1. He says, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who was declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection of the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord. So Paul is arguing the same point. And so what the resurrection is establishing is that Christ is Lord. And this is a remarkable counterclaim to what everybody else in the empire was saying. Okay, so in the empire, everybody is required to confess that Caesar is Lord. And with the resurrection, God is declaring, no, we have a new kingdom coming, okay? And in that kingdom, Christ is Lord. Jesus is Lord. So the resurrection tells us a third thing. It tells us that there is another kingdom. There is a different kingdom. It's a kingdom of which Jesus is Lord. So when Pilate says to Jesus, are you a king? And Jesus is very explicit, my kingdom is not of this world. And so there is a new kingdom, and the resurrection tells us that that kingdom is now breaking into this world. It is now invading this world. Fourth, the resurrection is the first fruits of the general resurrection of the saints. So we know that there is another resurrection coming. The resurrection of Jesus is not, as we said, a redefinition of what death is. It is rather the defeat of death. So Paul says, but now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. So Jesus' resurrection is the down payment, okay? And our resurrection is to come. But if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. Fifth, Jesus' resurrection is also the proof that God was satisfied with his offering on the cross. So Paul says, he who was delivered over because of our transgression and was raised because of our justification. If Christ had not been raised, we would have no confidence that God had accepted his sacrifice. But because he is raised, we know that God was satisfied with the sacrifice. And then the resurrection is the reaffirmation of the essential goodness of creation. God did not abandon Jesus' physical body to decay. It's God's way of saying, okay, Satan, you have corrupted this world, you've profaned my creation, but God is not going to leave it there. He is not going to let Satan win as far as the creation is concerned. He raised Christ from the dead. That's evidence of the value of Christ's body, and he's going to do the same with our bodies. We're not going to be just left in the grave to rot, but we will be resurrected as an affirmation of the essential goodness of all of creation, including our physical bodies. So I just have a summary slide there. We're running out of time, in which I just summarized those 6 points that we just talked about. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, I believe that the resurrection is really our ultimate apologetic. This is, Jesus said, and this is really kind of mind-boggling to me. Jesus says, blessed are those who having not seen believe. He's talking to Thomas, of course. And so we have all these people who had this tremendous privilege of seeing the risen Christ, and we think, well, wow, that would have been cool. But what Jesus says is there's a certain blessedness in those who are willing to accept that testimony of those who did see, but who themselves have not seen. And he says there is a certain blessedness to us. So this is the blessed hope. We come back then to that verse we started on clear back a year ago, right? But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you. That's what we're defending, folks. We're defending this hope of the resurrection of Jesus, and our own resurrection. So that is those are the planned lessons for the year. You all have endured and suffered and persevered, and you've made it through that. Okay? We do have, of course, a few weeks left. In your notes, I say next week we're going to listen to Moreland, but I changed it. I'm going to flip those around. Next week, I want to watch a video by John Lennox called The Winsome Apologist.